Happy Jewish American Heritage Month. My name is Alyssa Kraft, and welcome to today's special program hosted by American Jewish University's WISN for Open Learning in proud partnership with the Goldring Woldenberg Institute of Southern Jewish Life, an organization that supports, connects, and celebrates Jewish life across the American South. And that's, well, exactly what we're here to talk about today. Today, we are joined by historian, professor, and National Jewish Book Award winner, the author of The Jewish South, Shari Rabin. And she will be in conversation with Shira Muroff, director of programs at the Goldring Woldenberg Institute of Southern Jewish Life, where she connects Jewish communities across the South with resources about their local Jewish history. Together, they'll unpack stories of Southern Jewish life and how Jewish communities navigated religious identity, racial hierarchies, and major historical events across the South that was shaped by segregation, slavery, and so much change. And we'll also dive into Shari's background and foundation for her passion on this subject, and most importantly, how Jewish wisdom in the United States has been shaped by our ancestors who landed in America's southern states. A quick note that the conversation will run for about 30 minutes, and then the final 15 minutes will be Q&A. So be sure to put your questions in the Q&A function below. But without further ado, I will hand it off to Shari and Shira. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thanks, Alyssa. I'm excited to be here. And so, as Alyssa said, we're so excited to have Dr. Shari Rabin with us today. Shari is an historian of modern Judaism and American religions. Her first book, Jews on the Frontier, Religion and Mobility in 19th Century America, won the National Jewish Book Award in American Jewish Studies. She is an associate professor of Jewish Studies, Religion, and History at Oberlin College and serves as vice president of the Southern Jewish Historical Society. Welcome, Shari.
Thanks so much, Shira.
So just to get ourselves started, your book, The Jewish South, is the first scholarly overview of Jews in the South. What were your personal motivations for writing this book? Why were you drawn to researching Southern Jewish history?
Thanks again to Shira, to everybody at the American Jewish University for hosting us and for everybody who's attending. So the book does have a sort of personal component. I actually start in the prologue by describing kind of my own relationship to the topic and the origins of this book. I grew up in Milwaukee, and then when I was the day after my bat mitzvah, actually, we moved to Atlanta. So I had this sort of Midwestern and Southern kind of hybrid youth. And I think when I started kind of studying American Jewish history, that was very much kind of present with me as something that was shaping the questions that I had. And I sort of always felt like the New York Jewish story is so important and central, but it did not really reflect my own personal history. And I sort of felt like there was more to share from these other places that I had been so shaped by. So my first book is about mobility, movement in various sized communities across the US into the expanding West in the 19th century. And that's where I sort of first expressed this interest and explored this topic of Jewish life in all kinds of different places that people might not expect it. And then I ended up, after I finished my dissertation, getting a job at the College of Charleston in South Carolina. And so I moved there for 4 years. Part of my job was running a Center for Southern Jewish Culture. I was teaching Southern Jewish history. I was kind of immersed in it. And that sort of got me deeper into the topic. And then eventually an editor actually came to me and suggested this book. And at first I said, no, and I didn't, I thought I haven't done enough. I haven't learned enough. I can't do it. But then I sat on it for a while, and I sat down to try to, what would it look like to start to write a chapter of this kind of book? And it really just kind of flowed easily. And I realized that there was just so many fascinating stories and important subjects that were part of the Southern Jewish experience and history that hadn't gotten enough attention. And so, it ended up being a really fun fun and interesting challenge to try to kind of synthesize a bunch of material by other historians, local histories, right? Like the Jews of Texas, the Jews of Atlanta, the Jews of Petersburg, Virginia, right? So sort of synthesizing those, bringing in more recent scholarship in Southern Jewish history and American history, in other related fields, and then doing some amount of like original research in the archives, which I did do quite a bit for this project as well.
That's cool. That's awesome. I love hearing always like what has motivated people. Um, and so through all this research that you were doing, was there anything surprising that came out of either the research or your writing process?
Yeah, I mean, I found so many interesting tidbits, and the other sort of funny part about writing this is that I started writing it when I moved to Ohio, so it was interesting to then have this distance, but sort of be going back to Charleston and all these other southern places kind of every day in my research and writing, from a different location. I found so many interesting things, and I'd say like every one of these kind of local histories, many of them written like by rabbis in the communities, they collected so many sort of amazing details and so many amazing little stories, but they were sort of just presented as, part of this community history without sort of linking up to broader sort of themes in American history and American Jewish history. So a lot of what I saw my task is doing is kind of like rescuing these stories that were just sort of lying there in these mostly unread local histories and kind of elevate them and think about them as part of broader currents of Jewish history and Southern history.
That's great. Yeah, I think it was cool reading your book and really seeing those connections and being like, oh, I've worked with that community here and that community here, and we've heard their histories and really thinking about what was going on at that time. You wove that together very well, and that was amazing. And so you're going through all these different time periods. Was there one that ended up being your favorite time period to write about?
Yeah, I mean, it really stretched my kind of wings as a historian because I had focused on the mid 19th century, and now suddenly I was going, several centuries in one direction, a century in the other direction. So yeah, I mean, and probably the period that sort of caught me the most off guard was the earlier period, the colonial period. There is a lot of scholarship on sort of the Sephardic Atlantic world, and some of the southern communities, Charleston and Savannah, get sort of brought in with that larger sort of history. But I ended up finding some really interesting aspects of that past. In part, I think because the primary source base was much more limited. There weren't as many sort of documents from the period, and so I had to really sort of, get creative and like think hard about every single scrap of evidence that I had, and that ended up being really fruitful and interesting. So, like one example I love to give is, the congregation in Charleston, Kahal Kadosh Beth Elohim, KKBE, doesn't have really synagogue minutes from the 19th century. There's like a few scraps from the 18th century. There's a few scraps from the 1780s, but other than that, there's no congregational records. But everybody agrees the congregation was founded in 1749. So, okay, we know that gives us one piece of information. And what I ended up sort of thinking about is, well, what about the name? Right? We know that a congregation named Beth Elohim was created in 1749. And I don't think anybody had really stopped and thought hard about that before. And it gets interesting when you put it in this broader Atlantic Jewish context, because you look at the names of congregations in other places in this time period. There are things like Shereth Israel, Nidche Israel, Mikveh Israel, right? All of these, really messianic names, the hope of Israel, the remnant of Israel, the dispersed of Israel, really speaking to a deep, yearning for the messianic era that historians have seen as important within that largely Spanish and Portuguese Jewish community. But here we have the house of God, Beth Elohim, house of God. That seems like a really different sort of way to sort of put a name on your community for the public. And so with some other sources that I looked at from that period as well, I kind of see in that period a sort of a certain kind of Charleston specific sort of Jewish orientation in that period. That's, yes, looking to broader Jewish currents, but is really rooted in the place where their house of God is being established.
That was cool. That was something that did stick out to me reading your book in terms of the namings. We work with places across, 13 states. And I think our definition of the South is that our organization is a little different of the South that you framed it. Regardless, I think we cover at least 11 of the same states. But I think it was, cool as you were talking about, I forget if it was a period of like the late 1800s and some of the, different namings of some of the different congregations, a little westward of the Carolinas. And noticing like, oh, we know those communities and thinking about like where those names started and those different themes. It was never something that I'd seen in that overarching thematic way. So thank you kind of for pulling those together. But speaking of the Carolinas, one kind of document that you kind of mentioned is the, fundamental constitutions of the Carolinas. And how did that kind of set the trajectory for, Jewish experience in the colonies?
Yeah, that document was really, really important for my thinking about this project. And I first heard about it because, the Charleston Jewish community, understandably very proud of its history. You can take tours of the historic synagogue, of the historic cemetery. And so I first heard about this from the docents. I would take students there when I was teaching in Charleston, and they would always say, and Carolina was the most welcoming place to Jews. It offered right there in the founding documents freedom of worship to Jews, heathens, and other dissenters. And that was always like a laugh line because it seemed so, such a bizarre, grouping of terms. And so when I started teaching Southern Jewish history, I realized I need to actually go read this document and, like the quip that we get just from that one quote, what's going on kind of around it. And it turns out that the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina is a really, really important document more broadly in Carolina and kind of in the English colonies as a document that's showing evolving understandings of religion and race as separate categories. They're kind of emerging in this period and in like the colonial encounter. And so you see this document sort of framing religion as being about beliefs and also as something that will not affect anybody's civil status. That language is predominantly included to basically tell enslaved Africans that conversion to Christianity won't give them freedom, right? So it's trying to sort of exclude non-white Christians from political rights. But the sort of flip side of that is that it opens this door for Jews to be able to be considered as white citizens who are not Christian, right? So there's this disentangling of Christian and religion. And I think the Jews, heathens, and other dissenters, when you look sort of at the paragraph where that appears, it's really sort of describing the non-white quote unquote heathens and then the sort of white Protestant dissenters, your Quakers, your Baptists, etc. And so then I think including Jews sort of in there, I think points to a certain ambivalence, right? Like an uncertainty of which are they closer to? Are they more like these non-white sort of people with totally different religious viewpoints than us, or are they just, people with a different set of opinions? And it's fascinating too, as a document in just imagining a Jewish presence in this colony before anyone has even settled there. Jews had been expelled from England in 1290. The first part of the Code Noir, which governed New France, imagined Jews in order to expel them and exclude them. So it's kind of amazing at showing how in this sort of moment of colonial contact and settlement, there is an opening for a Jewish presence and Jewish equality, although there still is this sort of a certain sense of uncertainty around kind of what Jewish difference is. And that I think is a theme that you see throughout the book. In some ways, that's the story, the whole story of the book is this sort of uncertainty of kind of where to place Jews within these different ways of thinking about human difference.
Yeah, I think that definitely, stood out to me as I read it. And I think especially because, you mentioned it a bit, but that some of the first, earliest immigrants within the South were Sephardic and how that kind of, like starts to complicate this notion also of just Ashken normativity of, Jewish American history. How does that, continue to kind of play with this aspect of, race and religion and Jews and the way we tell the stories is by the fact that the first folks there were actually Sephardic immigrants.
Yeah, it's interesting. You do see in the colonial documents, you see Jews being talked about often as like Spanish also. So there's sort of there's a sort of national difference, a kind of foreignness, a non-Englishness that's kind of reinforcing their Jewishness. Although another interesting part of Carolina is that it was created as sort of a buffer from the Spanish, right? The Catholic
Yeah.
Spanish, who the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, like, had fled from, or their ancestors had fled from. So they're sort of seen as foreign in a way, but they have a shared enemy with the English, which is convenient. But yeah, absolutely. Throughout what becomes the United States, the first settlers are Spanish and Portuguese Jews. Many of these early congregations kind of hang on to a Sephardic identity, including in Charleston, even after the majority of the congregation is no longer Sephardic, which is interesting. You also see later on in the early 20th century, there's waves of migrations of Sephardic Jews from the Ottoman Empire to Atlanta and Montgomery. So, and even amongst Ashkenazi Jews, right? Like the middle of the 19th century, largely Central European, German-speaking Jews are a different story than the later Eastern European, Yiddish-speaking Jews. So there is sort of these different waves and these different kinds of Jews who are encountering one another and also encountering, their Christian neighbors, Black and white. And that's a sort of ongoing complicated dynamics. And I'll also mention here, just in talking about the, diversity of American Jews, I also do in this book pay attention first to the presence of African Americans kind of within Jewish communities broadly, and the role of, for instance, enslaved Africans in facilitating Jewish domestic and commercial life. And I also sort of tease out places where you can see some evidence of non-white Jewish folks. There's some scraps of evidence from the antebellum period of enslaved people who identified as Jews. There's another interesting sort of set of documents I found in the 1950s and 1960s where you see sort of African Americans trying to enter synagogues and Jewish communities. So I think I want to in thinking about how I was going to tell this story of such a big, a big swath of the American Jewish experience, something that was important to me was sort of, complicating how we thought about that history and who we included within that history. And there's some famous people in the book, right? You get Judah Benjamin and Leo Frank, but there's also much more obscure, ordinary people whose experiences I think are just as important and telling of the sort of complex dynamics within this region.
Yeah, and I think one of the pieces that continues to kind of complicate these narratives that sometimes we're told as we grow up is that, thinking about just immigration, especially, within 1800s, 1900s, in terms, sometimes we hear just, the Ellis Island stories, et cetera. But you mention, at the turn of the 20th century, many immigrants, being sent through Galveston, Texas. And how does that kind of, further expand what kind of our notion of American Jewish immigration is?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fascinating example. I talk about the Galveston Project, which was a small but important project to kind of route Jewish immigrants away from New York, right? Where there was a lot of impoverishment, suffering, and also attention to immigrant Jews. So there's this effort to move them elsewhere. Another fascinating effort I talk about is the Industrial Removal Office, which tried to take Jews who were in New York and sort of distribute them to Jewish communities throughout the South. So that's it's fascinating for the reason you say, right? First of all, just like pointing to alternate routes sort of into different parts of the American continent for Jewish immigrants. It's also worth noting there are Jews who show up at Ellis Island and then move south on their own for various reasons, or who pretty quickly move on. So part of it is like that Ellis Island was not the end point for everybody, and it was not the starting point for everybody, right? There's different kinds of pathways, but that's also a fascinating experience because a fascinating moment because it's showing the sort of Northern Jewish leaders and organizations kind of thinking about the South and then sort of negotiating with Southern communities. Like I talk about the correspondence between like the committee in Macon, Georgia, that is set up to like welcome these new immigrants, and then the people in New York, and the people in New York are imagining like, oh yeah, we'll just send them down and everything will be easy. And then the Jewish community in Macon is saying, no, actually, this is a very delicate sort of ecosystem here. People have to come who can do the right kind of work. Wages are low because of exploitation of Black workers. So there is this interesting sort of interplay there between North and South as part of this broader effort to try to figure out how to help these immigrants.
Yeah, and I think it was very interesting to kind of hear the different pieces of that Galveston project, and the realities of people thinking about the South. And I liked your point that, we might have some famous names in here that people know, but a lot of it is the everyday Jews that, framed and shaped these communities. So thinking about that is that, one of the fascinating parts about working for the Institute of Southern Jewish Life is that we kind of, coexist, thinking ahead a couple of decades from what we were just talking about, is we coexist with, Southern Jewish civil rights history every day. Our office in Jackson, Mississippi, our offices are housed within the Beth Israel congregation, which is the same building, the literal same building that was bombed in 1967 due to the local rabbi, Perry Nussbaum's civil rights work. And in spite of the community's efforts, and their complicated feelings, around this work and the complicated narratives that, people had, the different opinions. However, we know that many of these histories are relatively unknown to many in the larger Jewish community. And so when you teach about Southern Jewish history during the civil rights movement, who are maybe some other, figures or even trends that you like to highlight to kind of complicate different narratives or just bring other names to the forefront?
Yeah, so I think I look at some of the famous rabbis. Rabbi Nussbaum's definitely in here, and Rabbi Rothschild from Atlanta. I think less known is Burton Podol from Charleston, who's a really fascinating person who comes to Charleston because he wants to sort of advance the cause of civil rights, and then kind of immediately and dramatically comes up against a very resistant congregation. And yeah, I think so. There's a number of different kinds of characters. I look at Reform rabbis, especially who saw, the plight of African Americans, the struggle for civil rights as a Jewish issue. I think, looking more broadly at the wide array of Southern Jews who are, figuring out how to react to desegregation is sort of, I look at the different kind of spaces in which the movement progressed, some of which were more or less relevant to Southern Jews, right? Like the buses, desegregation of buses, most Southern Jews are middle class at that point. They have cars. That's feels less sort of crucial, although there are, some Jewish efforts kind of around that. More relevant are, the schools, public schools, which have been, so important for American Jews broadly and sort of their, coming into American identity. The stores that sort of made the fortunes of many, of some Southern Jewish families. Those are important spaces. And I think, it was proceeding sort of gradually through these different spaces. And I think there was a tendency on the part of many Southern Jews to try to kind of avoid this political conversation and to try to compartmentalize it as sort of an American problem, not a Jewish problem, and to sort of like look inwards and focus on like, doing the work of developing their synagogues and congregational activities. So there's sort of this is the Jewish sphere that we're going to focus on rather than these sort of political activities. But then some of these rabbis were and other activists were pushing in another direction and saying really strongly this is a Jewish cause and we want our community to come on board with that. Burton Podol in Charleston eventually kind of gives up on convincing his congregation that's a Jewish cause, and there's a sermon after the Voting Rights Act is passed, I think, where he says like, okay, I haven't convinced you, but like at least be convinced it's an American cause. We should care about it for that reason. So that's kind of part of how I talk about it. It's worth noting too that there was a real active threat for of retaliation for this kind of activity, like we see in Jackson, where the synagogue and Rabbi Nussbaum's home are bombed. So that's a very real sort of fear that's in the backdrop of all of these conversations. And actually, you and I kind of were first in touch because of a document that gets at sort of another aspect of this that I think is important to recognize, which is that the civil rights movement and the effort for desegregation also moved into to synagogues.
Yeah.
So there's a letter from Rabbi Nussbaum that I'll be publishing soon in the journal Southern Jewish History, which is him sort of asking for advice about how to deal with a white Jewish man and his Black wife who is a convert to Judaism, who might want to join the congregation. What does he do if the leadership of his congregation refuses them membership, right? And so this shows the sort of, right, he's writing exactly a year after his home was bombed, right? But he knows that, Judaism says a convert to Judaism is a Jew, and that's that, right? So you see this kind of the civil rights movement being brought right into the kind of heart of American Jewish communities in a way that I think is important to recognize.
Yeah, and I think, talking about that, reminds us that number one, I think something that I only, have learned in my decade almost of living in the South is that, amongst just American Jewry in general, Southern American Jewry is the most diverse. And I think that's an important, thing to kind of know, in relation to also the fact that being a Southern Jew means also you're just a double minority within America by being Jewish and then also being Southern and Jewish. And as a fun fact for people listening in, if you don't count Florida as part of the South, because we know that, Southern Florida has a larger Jewish population, if the South only has about 7% of the American Jewish population. And that's not too different from what the percentage was in around like 1899. So that's also just something interesting to think about being this double minority. And is there another example, just another quick example, about how that, kind of affects the Southern Jewish community and like another time period throughout your book?
Well, it's worth noting my friends in Charleston would want me to say that in the 1820s, Charleston had the largest Jewish community in the United States. So,
Yes.
and I think one thing that is important when looking at some of these like historic communities and these small town communities is nobody knew, which towns were going to become Atlanta and which ones weren't, right? So there's this constant sort of history of migration that is important. And the in the 1820s, the Southern city had the largest Jewish community. I mean, I think it's a minority, but it's one that's very visible within Southern communities, and I think also within kind of American Jewish communities. So I think that has at various points lends itself to sort of extra attention and scrutiny, sometimes in ways that feel helpful and sometimes in ways that don't. And another interesting part of it too is that even though Southern Jews are sort of are a minority within the American Jewish community, there have been moments in which they've been very overrepresented in certain movements, like Reform Judaism in the 19th century. So it's interesting to see how, I resist the idea that the South is like radically different from other parts of the country. I think it's, highlights certain features of American life, but is really part of American history broadly. But there are moments in which you can see the kind of particular conditions of life in the South leading to certain kinds of tendencies, and Reform Judaism's rise is one place where you can see that.
Yeah, I think that was definitely a very interesting narrative that I learned more about in your book. I've learned so much reading your book. Thank you so much for chatting today in this talk. Kind of as a wrap-up question before we head into the Q&A is, what would you tell people are the like most important narratives, or if you want to just pick, one and a half, two, like narratives about Southern Jewish history that they should learn from the book?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a lot of different things that the book, highlights the presence of Jews in all kinds of places and the like tenacity of Jewish people to make lives in places that others might think are unlikely. The importance of religion and race together, sort of, being important factors shaping Jewish experiences. But I think maybe what I'll sort of focus on is I think a big part of my sort of project is to just sort of show how fully part of American and Southern history Jews are from the very beginning. Right, 1669, they're imagining this presence, and it's a presence that comes to fruition, and in ways that I think some of us might see as positive, and in ways we think of as negative. Jews are sort of not exempt from the like rough and tumble of the sort of messy and fascinating history of the United States and of the South. So I think that's a big part of what I'm hoping to show with this book, and I think it also sort of I think can speak more more broadly to ideas about the South as a region and given different sort of perspective on sort of what has marked that region. Yes, racial hierarchy, but also a sort of pervasive kind of Christian norms, and also, cities, transnational connections, multilingualism, religious diversity, right? Jews are part of the South, and the South is a South that had Jews in it.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great way to frame that. Okay, we ready for some Q&A?
Yeah.
Let's do it. How about this? What impact would you say has the rise of Christian evangelicalism had on Southern Jews?
Yeah, so this is a really big question. And in there's sort of which evangelicals, right? Historians, point to the Great Awakening of the 18th century, the Second Great Awakening of the 19th century. Some historians recently want to say, evangelicalism as we know it is really post World War II. So there's different eras. I do think that being surrounded by enthusiastic Protestant Christians kind of shapes how Jews kind of think about themselves. And I think that's part of the sort of part of the negotiations around sort of how do we adapt to Judaism to the situation we're in has to do with kind of looking at what other Jews are doing. And yeah, so there's in the 18th century, I do see some signs in Charleston of an influence from the Great Awakening and a sort of growing sort of theological sort of interest and consciousness in sort of providential theology in particular. I track in some sources. I'll say also, like in the aftermath of the Second Great Awakening, in some ways it makes things more challenging for Southern Jews because a big part of that movement was an effort to sort of, enshrine aspects of Protestant Christianity in the law. Sunday closing laws, for instance, those are like the bane of Southern Jews' existence for most of the 18th and 19th century, and those are the effort of evangelical Christians to imprint public life with what they see as kind of right behavior and piety. This is maybe a place to say that I end the book in the late 1960s, before the kind of the dramatic rise of the sort of current wave of evangelical Christians. It was a choice I made because I think there is so much more. It was just really daunting to think about everything that has happened since the late 1960s and all of the sources that are available. And there hasn't been a lot of scholarship yet, sort of putting together the puzzle pieces. So I think there's a lot more to tell about that history. I sort of wrap it up really quickly in the epilogue, give a very quick overview. But I end in the 1960s where I think there's this kind of moment of the end of the classical civil rights movement, right? 1967 also for American Jews with the Six-Day War, right? It's a moment of transition and shift that I felt like, okay, this is a place that it makes sense to kind of pause in and let others take the story forward.
Thank you. Somebody wants to know if you identify any influences on things such as culture, business, education, politics, etc., throughout the historic time span of your research.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Jews are part of, creating these Southern communities in a really distinct way. The first chapter opens with the observations of English colonial officials who notice like a Jewish person like planting a vineyard and a Jewish person like teaching everybody how to build houses, right? So kind of from the get-go, you have their sort of, especially in that early moment, they're, rolling up their sleeves and getting to work with building this colony, along with other white settlers and enslaved and native peoples. So absolutely, they're building this society from the start. And as the history progresses, Jews are often very active in business, in philanthropy, in public life. Like pretty early on, Southern Jews are being elected to various public offices. You have Jewish mayors and other elected officials. So absolutely, they kind of put their stamp on the communities that they live in a really direct way. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, next question. How have the location of colleges and universities influenced the establishment and either like growth or demise of Jewish communities in the South?
Yeah, so it's interesting. You see there's a few things I'll say related to this. First of all, you see kind of in the 20th century, especially in the era of restrictive quotas on many elite northern universities, there are more northern Jews kind of coming south to the University of Alabama, the University of Georgia, et cetera, for an education. So there's this sort of, a kind of temporary migration for education that happens. I have a colleague, an American Jewish historian named Kirsten Vermeglich, who's working now on sort of academic migration of American Jews. And I think that is part of the kind of post-World War II story, and especially of the last couple of decades, is migration of like Jewish faculty members to places where colleges and universities are established. That's why I visited Oxford, Mississippi last year to speak at the Oxford Jewish Federation, which was established, I think, in 2015 or 2010, something like that. So yeah, absolutely. There's sort of the map of Southern Jewish communities kind of ebbs and flows, and different places pop up at different eras, and colleges and universities have been one important sort of draw factor for Jews to some Southern places.
Thank you. And I'll just say, I'm going to give a quick, plug in the middle of the Q&As. I know some people are asking questions about specific, like smaller towns, and we might not have a chance to answer all of the questions today. Want to just remind folks that the ISJL does have an encyclopedia of Southern Jewish communities. And so if you go on our website, you're able to see that going state by state, city by city throughout the South, and that can provide you with some of that information. And we're always happy to answer other questions. But that is a resource that I want to make sure folks know, a free online encyclopedia. Okay, jumping back. Where did the Southern Jews originate from between the years of 1880 to 1914? Where are they coming from?
Yeah, I mean, sort of all over Eastern Europe, places where other Jews were coming from. I have some other colleagues in Charleston who have been doing work recently on people from a town called Kalushin in Eastern Europe who moved to Charleston and actually created a Landsmannschaft, a Kalushiner society in Charleston. So I'm excited to see the work that they're doing, and what's going to sort of come from that. And I think, yeah, that kind of granular sort of ability to see the specific places that people came from, and how sort of those hometown ties and family ties shaped migration is a really important piece of the puzzle. And of course, as I mentioned too, right, you also see migration from Rhodes, from Thessaloniki, from places in the Ottoman Empire in the 1910s and 1920s to Atlanta especially.
Cool, thank you. Is there any documentation about how the Jews in the South reacted to Jewish activists from the North who came down to work in the civil rights movement along with Black folks in the South?
Yes, and there's a lot of grumpy accounts of this. I think probably one of my favorites that I encountered in writing this book was I went to the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, and they had an audio recording of a sermon by Rabbi Milton Grafman in Birmingham, who's considered to be one of the rabbis kind of called out by Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter from Birmingham jail. And it's just amazing as somebody who started as a 19th century historian to be able to listen to audio recordings in any event. And it's from the early 1960s, and he talks kind of powerfully in that sermon, expresses a sentiment that I think you see amongst other Southern Jews in the period too, of feeling like his colleagues are constantly kind of calling him and badgering him and telling him what to do, and not really knowing what he actually is doing and making assumptions. And so feeling kind of beleaguered from this kind of Northern attention. There's also, the Southern Jewish activists from the North who come South, and that freaks out a lot of people in these communities who are worried about, what kind of attention is this going to bring to our community? Part of Rabbi Nussbaum in Jackson, part of his origin story is that he kind of got involved in civil rights activism when there were Northern Jewish activists imprisoned at Parchman Penitentiary in Mississippi. And he decided, and this was controversial among his rabbinic colleagues, he decided, like, these are like these are Jews. These are my flock too. I'm going to go and, be a resource and an aid to these, incarcerated Jewish activists from the North. Not everybody was on board with that. Other rabbinic colleagues, certainly among his congregants, that was controversial. But yeah, I think ambivalence, fear, and in some cases, Nussbaum especially, and Embrace. There's a piece that was written by a Jewish lawyer who went to the South to work on some of these issues in the 1960s. And he talks about there being what he calls Mississippi Marranos, so sort of Southern Jews who like invite him to dinner and kind of in the privacy of their own home sort of express their agreement with him, but don't feel able to sort of publicly address it. So yeah,
Yeah,
complicated story.
complicated. And I'll say for anybody who wants to hear and kind of learn more about Rabbi Grafman's speeches, we have an episode of our Southern and Jewish podcast that focuses on him in that time exactly. Okay, next another question. I know we have a couple more minutes, but to what extent were Jews accepted as opposed to being merely tolerated, or even the objects of hostility? And if there was hostility, was it because of their religion, their mercantile presence, their social activism, or other reasons?
Yeah, that's a big question. And I think it varies over time and place, and even from like, interaction to interaction, right? Like what's happening between any given Jewish person and non-Jewish person at any given point. So yeah, I think there are times, I think in the early Republic, there's moments of greater sort of openness and embrace, like public officials, making gifts of Jewish books to the synagogue in Charleston, for example. But then at other points, no. So one example also from Charleston is in 1812, the governor declares a Christian fast day, and the Jews complain, and then he says, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And then 30 years later, the same thing happens, and that time the governor says, like this is a Christian state, like stop complaining. Right? So this history is not a linear story of sort of increasing, acceptance and embrace over time, for sure. So yeah, sorry, the question was about, can you repeat the second half of the question?
Oh, sure. Opposed, tolerated, etc. But was it because of their religion, mercantile presence, social activism?
I think it's hard to disentangle, and I think all of them were kind of intertwined. One moment where you see this is after the Civil War, and after the rise of the first Ku Klux Klan, there's a congressional investigation into the Klan, and there's a sort of massive, hearing testimonies that were published, and there's it recounts all of this like incredible violence happening, in the Reconstruction era, and there are a few cases in there of Jewish merchants who were murdered by white supremacists in that period. And even there, it's sort of they're being aligned with the sort of hated Republican Party. They're being accused of being sort of overly friendly with African Americans who often were their customers, right? And there's, they're identifiable as Jews who also were probably immigrants, and in a few cases we know they were immigrants. So it's sort of hard to disentangle fully. And I think kind of part of what I want to show in this book is how kind of religion and race remain sort of entangled in so many ways. There's sort of this vacillating in different kind of moments and contexts between sort of Jews as kind of our white fellow citizens who just have different opinions and go to a different church, or that's sort of one direction, and then the other direction is Jews as this kind of fundamentally, innately other group of sort of questionable racial as well as religious difference. So they sort of remain intertwined, and Jews get it sort of goes back to Jews, heathens, and other dissenters. That's kinds of ends up framing their experience in a lot of ways, right? How different are they? How do we make sense of their difference?
Amazing, thank you. I'm going to throw in one last question that kind of connects to the bookend of your book. Was how did Southern Jews feel about the lynching of Leo Frank? Was it a wake-up call?
Yeah, so I talk about the Frank lynching extensively in one of the chapters. It is of course, a sort of horrifying moment and in American history broadly and in Southern Jewish history of this kind of this intense, focus on Jewish difference as sort of pathological, right? Leo Frank is not just a person who, goes to a different church. There's something in the eyes of, white Southerners, especially something more fundamentally different and wrong about him. And I'd say it was really horrifying to Southern Jews. And, the Frank's rabbi, there's fascinating sources, his rabbi in Atlanta kind of afterwards trying to kind of make sense of it and, in some ways saying like this was always here, but now this is like this anti-Jewish hatred is now being like flamed up. In other cases, he's sort of thinking about Frank in this like, role of martyr. You can see him really grappling with how to make sense of this. And I think, I mentioned in the book, I found a source as late as like 1940 saying, Jews in Atlanta will not talk about this. So I think it does, cast a large shadow and shows the sort of, it's sort of the apex of this kind of the fragility of Jewish belonging in America and in the South, right? He was a, well-to-do, English-speaking member of the temple, had done kind of everything right, and yet still in this moment became the sort of symbol of this kind of pathological difference that led to his murder.
Thank you. And I'm sorry for everybody else that I couldn't get to your questions. There were so many amazing questions. But I know that if you, follow Sherry in her book, follow the ISJL, we'd be happy to have you engaged in, her book and engaging in that and engaging in our programming. And I appreciate you all being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Shira, Sherry. Incredible conversation. There's so much more to unpack here, but I encourage everyone on to purchase Sherry's book, The Jewish South. You can find the link to that book purchasing link in the chat. So definitely check that out. And thank you to the audience for joining us today during this program for Jewish American Heritage Month. Once again, please purchase the book and dive deeper into this story. And you can also follow Sherry online on her link, which is also in the chat. Feel free to ask her any questions that maybe you didn't get answered today. And as always, as a nonprofit educational institution, American Jewish University relies on support from people like you. So please consider a donation. Check out the link in the chat so that we can continue to make these free and accessible for everyone. And finally, thank you so much to our partners, the Goldring Woldenberg Institute of Southern Jewish Life. Your partnership here is invaluable. Thank you again, Shira and Sherry, for being on with us today. And to our audience, we will see you next time.
Thank you.